So good afternoon. My name is Stéphan, Vincent-Lancrin. I work at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I'm going to talk to you about an ongoing project that we have on creativity and critical thinking and how to foster that. So, yeah, it doesn't work very well. Let me see. Here we are. Thank you. So this work actually is very much part of all the different initiatives on 21st century skills. So the way we approached it was to, probably my phone should be somewhere else. The way to approach it was actually to look at what the skills for innovation are. So what we did is to look at what differentiates people who are innovating in the economy from those who are not. And so for that, we actually use a survey in 19 countries of graduate students 5 years after graduation in employment. And so who were asked, what are the skills that you use the most in your current job? As you can see, what comes first is use your time efficiently, perform under pressure, etc. But when we try to see what are the skills that those who are highly innovative, which we define as being in an organization at the forefront of innovation and participating oneself in the innovation process, then you can see that what distinguishes those who are in this job from the other ones is actually coming up with new ideas and solutions, the willingness to question ideas, the creativity, critical thinking. And the other interesting aspect is that they also use all these skills, or they declare that they use all these skills much more than everyone else, So there is much more intensity of that. So it's interesting. It comes from a survey of about 20,000 individuals, representative samples in 19 countries. But as you know, if you go to many employer fora, you will hear that, what are the main skills that they believe people should have. Usually you have problem solving, complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, and actually there has been a shift with a stronger emphasis on these skills. Of course, with all the discourse and all the changes that we can see here about artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., we know that the thing that people will do are the thing that computers will have more difficulties doing, and actually that's why creativity and critical thinking and many social and emotional skills have become so important. So we've grouped these different skills. We had too many in three big categories. What we've called the technical skills, which is, which are the know-how and know-what, the content knowledge and the procedural knowledge in different domains. The skills in thinking and creativity, and that's really what we're going to focus on. And the social and emotional skills of the behavioral and social skills, around collaboration, persistence, etc. What's important in that is these different skills, they overlap. You need to actually have some level of persistence if you want to learn something. You need to know something if you want to be a critical thinker or a creative in a certain domain. But they're different. The point being that having one figure, it's not because, for example, you're good in physics, that necessarily it means that actually you're persistent in physics, that you're a good communicator in physics, that you're a creative thinker in physics, etc. So these are two different things. And actually, we've done some work on that, and we can show that, and there's a consensus in the research literature as well, that creativity, critical thinking are things which are overall domain-specific. But, of course, even so that domain-specific, there are some general traits that actually are the same across all the domains. And so the idea is probably that when we talk about transversal skills or the fact that they're domain generic, what we mean is that we can apply them in different domains. And even so, we'll have to learn again. We'll have these kind of habits of mind that will actually help us to, again, develop these different skills a bit more quickly. So that's why actually school is a very interesting place for the acquisition of these skills, because we learn in so different domains and we can reapply them in different ways. So one interesting aspect is that actually the general population in many countries, so that's a question that the Pew Research Centre asked, in a survey of the population, and you can see that in most countries, the population believes that actually the schools should focus on training students to be creative and think independently rather than, the more traditional vision of schooling that we have around the acquisition of basic academic skills and discipline. And actually, you can see that there are a few exceptions. South Africa, France, Nigeria, United Kingdom, and Kenya. But in all the other countries, actually, there is a slightly bigger valuation of creativity, critical thinking over the traditional domains of schooling. So the question that we have after that is basically, what do we mean exactly? That's so everyone agrees. The population agrees usually, and so what does it mean to be a creative thinker, critical thinker in school, basically, and for 9-year-old or 13-year-old or whatever. So in fact, the curricula in virtually all the OECD countries now have integrated this idea of 21st century skills. They mention the 21st century skills. They will mention typically creativity and critical thinking. They have, this relationship of, many competency-based curricula. But in fact, nonetheless, they remain a bit at odds with these ideas in the way, actually, even how the curricula are presented. So you will have, you want people to be creative, but once you go to the more technical part of the curriculum, you read, the students should be able to solve a problem in words and do this type of divisions, of multiplications, or whatever. So if you want, there is a little bit of a disconnect between the two. The teachers actually do not disagree. I've never heard many people saying, what you're saying is totally crazy. We certainly don't want this to happen. So the big problem that we believe is actually a question of translation. It's not so much that people don't want, that teachers are resistant to change, they don't want to change or whatever. It's more that they don't know what to do and how to do it, what it looks like, and what we're really talking about. And so we've launched this, a new project which is very much around that. How can we actually build a new social representation of that, a common language, and how can we relate it with assessment? Because we know that teaching, learning, and assessing go all together. Can I have the next one? So we've launched this project 3 years ago. We're going to have the final results in 1 year. And basically the idea is, one, to articulate a common language and see if we can do that internationally. So can we agree on what we mean and on a set of words. We try to develop an exemplary toolkit of pedagogical resources to support teachers across this network. Try to identify a progression scale. That we haven't succeeded fully on that one, I shall say. Try to identify the aspects that actually matter for the development of the different things, and try to evaluate actually the different strategies that have been used across our network on that. So we've been working in 11 countries. Well, no. So what we've tried to do is actually to work with all these different countries at the beginning to develop these different tools. So what we've, the first thing that we had was actually to translate these big words, creativity and critical thinking, in a rubric, something that actually is more accessible for teachers, and try to actually, through an iterative process, try to improve it. We've asked the different teams to tell us how they've actually implemented it, and so to show us the kind of lesson plans and the kind of pedagogical activities they've put in place. And through this process, we've actually refined and improved over time these different things. The idea at this stage is really to have a pilot, and then we're going to start in the second phase more validation work of that. And after that, obviously, the OECD is not an education, doesn't run an education system, so countries will see what they want to do with it after that. So we've been working in 11 countries, including the United States, with about 17,000 students, many teachers. in Brazil and in very diverse countries. So that's an interesting point. It's not like we worked in all the Nordic European countries or in all the English-speaking countries. No, we had the US, Brazil, Russia, Slovakia, Hungary, France, UK, India, Thailand. So very diverse sets of countries. And actually we had one team which is that you may know, which is very close to here to San Diego, and that's the Vista Unified School District, and they are here in the room, and they've actually implemented this work and done it in a very interesting way with a lot of critical thinking, independence, and professionalism. So what part of the work is actually really development work, you know. So it's how building common language. It's not just words, so that's what we've discovered. So that what we've tried to do is to have a set of different things, and we are now working with other colleagues, like learning ventures on developing a new tablet application to actually put it in the hands of the teachers. So it's a set of 4 different things, I would say, that we've done. Rubrics on the one hand, a portfolio of rubrics, pedagogical activities, assessments, and student work. The rubrics were used actually to develop activities. So how do we actually do things that will allow you to see the kind of sub-dimensions of creativity and critical thinking that you could see? It's to improve existing lesson plan that you have, to assess the student work, so with actually the more usual, what we've called the scaffolding rubrics, but that could be called a scoring rubric, and it's also just to understand conceptually what we're talking about. So what we've had, and that's an important point, so we've tried to make it as simple as possible, but we have a portfolio of rubrics. Some people, this one is a class-friendly rubric. We've called it the simplified rubric. You know, we have one which is a bit more comprehensive, but some teachers didn't like it. Other teachers did like it, so we have kept both. We have derivatives in different domains. So we have one for mathematics, for science, for music, for... and what we've actually tried to emphasize, so you can see on the creativity side, so it's about inquiring, imagining, doing, and reflecting. And creativity actually was the easier one, interestingly. You know, so it's about playing with unusual ideas, ideation, fluency, etc. But it's also producing something and trying to have a level of reflection, so assessing what has been done. The critical thinking part was paradoxically more difficult because critical thinking is often confused with problem solving, but it's not problem solving. You know, problem solving is part of what I would call the technical skills. You know, so for example, if you're in mathematics, you solve problems. That's the job. That's part of the job. It's part of the technical part. Critical thinking, we've put an emphasis more on perspective taking. So understanding that you can look at things from different perspectives, that you have, you know, there was a session on questioning. So how do you question things and how do you get higher levels of questioning? But of course, there is another understanding of critical thinking, which I believe is actually, quite common in classroom, which is how to weigh arguments. So, you know, how do you know, can you justify what you're saying? And that's also one of the parts that we've tried to cover, but it's not exactly the same as challenging assumptions, challenging a theory, understanding what are the limitations, that you could actually look at it from other perspectives that would also make sense. So that's on the rubrics. But the rubrics, interestingly enough, we managed to reach an agreement relatively quickly across this vast network. Everyone agreed on the words. And then when we started to see actually the pedagogical activities coming, then we felt like, everyone agrees, but probably then not everyone understands all these different things the same way, because some of the things that we were seeing, you know, didn't quite match our ideas of creativity or critical thinking at the end. So we had actually to also give examples to some of the teachers. So we worked with pedagogues on the one hand, and part of it came really from teachers, and to try to illustrate the way of how to create some space for students to develop their creativity and critical thinking. So I don't have time to give you an example of you know, the kind of activities, but yes, that's really what we try to do in that, is to not actually develop a prescriptive lesson plans. It's more lesson plans which are meant to inspire teachers, give them some ideas, trigger ideas, and that we want them to be able to actually match to the different steps of the rubrics. But in terms of activities, what we've seen, the kind of expectation that we had is we found that a nice way to assess an activity that would at a minimum meet our requirements would be that literate students need interest to learn, so it starts with a driving question or something challenging questions at the beginning, that they have to be challenging enough, so that's one of the big difficulties. Sometimes there is great stuff which is done, but it's too easy, so it's not interesting at the end for the students. They have to develop clear technical knowledge, and that's sometimes one of the difficulties, the balance between the technical knowledge and the more philosophical aspect of the question, so how are you actually doing part of the practice? That they have a product. So when I say product, it can be a performance, but you do something, and it's the product is not just taking a test at the end to just verify that what you've done is understood. That the students co-design part of the solution. So that's the interesting part. You need to have a certain kinds of problems, of tasks to create this room. So you need to have, for example, a problem that can be looked at from different perspectives. Otherwise, it's, so in the terms of the questioning that we've seen in another session, you need to have a certain complexity of the question that you're asking. And what's very difficult, perhaps, from a teaching perspective, is that you need to leave room for the unexpected, because if you let the students co-design some of the activities, then perhaps it will go into a direction that you don't really master, and you have to accept that it's okay, you don't need to have the answer to all the different questions that they may have. And of course, these things take also time, etc. The third thing that we did was to look at assessments. So can we have traditional assessments, or can we have different types of assignments? And actually on that point, one of the big questions is, what is the balance between assessing the product and the process? Especially when we want to give some space to the possible mistakes, So some of the teams we've been working with, like actually the Montessori schools in the public sector here in the United States, what they look at is more the learning environment, more than the other aspects, and they've actually developed a tablet for that. And so we've been trying to look at things from this perspective as well. Student artifacts are quite important because I would say in the technical skills, people wouldn't say that I'm just interested in the process, they want to see that you know something at the end. And so we believe this is something that is, the enhancements of their creativity and critical thinking should also be visible in the final product, not in one instance, so perhaps one it will not be so great, but overall, there should be something that is visible in that. And then we had some interesting discussions about do we need creative education to have creative and critical thinkers or not? So can actually the creative and critical thinking skills be acquired through a more traditional way? And so it's interesting because in our network we had, I would say, some teaching traditions which are much more in terms of knowledge transmission, and others which are more student-centered. And so we have different types of approaches that were tried. So my feeling is that it's better to have creative education to foster that, because then there is the role modeling effect that happens. But perhaps it's not totally impossible to actually improve things in a more traditional way. So finally, we want actually, as part of that, to have some examples of student work so that teachers can see what, through artifacts, what it means to be, a critical thinker level 1 in mathematics when for grade 8 or etc. So at the end, what we want with this is really to support the teachers, but in fact, that's but of course, without being disruptive. So the idea is not to change the curriculum or everything, we want that to be applied sometimes in an interdisciplinary way, but also in different domains. So the idea is not to disrupt everything, it's just really to improve things. So the second part that we've been doing is to, we always tell our member countries, well, when you do something, you should actually evaluate what you're doing. So what we've tried is to do that at the same time. So at this stage, we've really developed instruments to evaluate in a more rigorous way in the second stage the work, but nonetheless, we have a few preliminary findings on that. So first, we know that the teachers have changed a bit, their practices. I'm going to just use, the work is still being done, so that I've cherry-picked some of the first results, and obviously I've chosen some of the more positive ones, but perhaps the more negative ones will come later, and we can discuss them next year. But you can see that first there was a change in the belief of the teachers who thought that actually this is something that can be taught, and that in school, so that in those who were part of the intervention group. So we had two groups, control group, intervention group, and we've tried to evaluate the effects for quasi-experimental design. Good thing is that the teachers have changed their report. They believe that it has a positive impact on the student motivation. One of the big questions that we always have is how it's going to affect the PISA scores of the students, the PL scores, etc. So that's something that we've looked at. We have mixed results, but you can see, for example, in primary schools, so both in Thailand and in Hungary, we had very positive effects on that. In secondary, it's a bit less striking. There is not, so here in Thailand, there is a slightly positive effect. In Hungary, a slightly negative. Even so, the two groups here are not matched yet properly. And so what are the things that we could see that it works a little bit better in primary than in secondary from what we can see. It's easier to do apparently in primary education than in secondary. Now in terms of student reports, one of the things that we wanted to see is to what extent from the student perspective there was a change in the pedagogical practices or in the perception of these pedagogical practices. And you can see that some of the things that we wanted to achieve were achieved. So like in Thailand, for example, where we look, students have to look for several explanations, in Hungary as well. And in terms of curiosity, also the question of, do I want to learn things that I don't already know, that I'm not interested in? And then you can see that, in fact, in the intervention group in Hungary, there was a strong effect on that, a bit less in Thailand, where it was a bit more similar, but didn't change so much. So what are the next steps for us on that? So one of them actually is that this is feeding, that's why we have PISA in the title, the next innovative domain of the PISA test, which will have a creative thinking as part of it. So it's PISA 2021, which means that we won't have the data before 23, but it's coming, and actually it will really cast light on the importance of these different domains. There's a lot of interesting challenges which are related to that. What we're trying to do as well is to expand this work. So now we've done this work in primary and secondary education, and we're just about to start work in higher education and in teacher education, so that in fact we have a systemic innovation and we can see to what extent this works across the whole education pipeline. And what we're going to do is, now that we have this bank of pedagogical resources, is to try to validate these things. So what happens once we put this tablet and these pedagogical resources in the hands of a more representative sample of teachers? What kind of professional development do they need? What kind of scaffolding? Do we see the effect that we want to see? How does it work? How have these things to be fine-tuned? And then we hope that after that, countries themselves will actually take it to continue. So my concluding remarks, basically what we already know at this stage. One is that we can have an international language on that. That we also know that it's difficult to change the teaching and learning practice, and that it requires a lot of professional development, of support, and of time. What we've seen from the first results of these is that we can see real change in teaching of the students, in their perceptions of how this should be done. And that in terms of teachers, actually, what we've discovered is that we needed more artifacts, so more tools is better than less, and and that all this common understanding came from a multiplicity of different things. What we hope and that we want to see, and I hope that that's what the report will show at the end of this year, is that it also actually shows much more engagement, not just as reported by the teachers and the teams that have done it, but by the students themselves, more engagement in their learning, broader acquisition of skill set, and much stronger social and emotional skills as well that will come with that. So I think that was my last one, so I thank you very much.